Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry.
Hey, I'm Chris Gehrz.
You're back.
What am I doing here?
Wow, that is good to see.
I thought I'd slip in just at the tail end, just to show that I actually exist. I'm not just
right.
a bot out there sending you email announcements constantly.
Did you catch our Chekhov's gun reference last episode?
I did not.
Okay, we'll talk about that later.
Driving many places.
All right. Well, Chris, you are back from a very long odyssey of sorts.
6,000 miles, I calculated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you? I know we travel a lot together in January. And we also always like to find CWC connections on trips. Was there any big CWC connections?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, because we don't do a lot of American history in the course, but what we do at the end from the 18th into the 19th century is basically on the East Coast, right? And so there are a few spots. Like, I started by doing some research at the Library of Congress, which was initially founded by Thomas Jefferson, giving part of his book collection to the government. And it was a reminder of the kind of Enlightenment origins of the United States. And then I spent most of my time at Yale University doing research. Yale has residential colleges that are they have a kind of academic role, but they're living spaces. One of them is Jonathan Edwards College. So there's an Edwards College, and that made me think of the First Great Awakening. But my favorite example of it was, it's kind of tangentially connected to our course, but I thought about it revising the assignment for this week about the 18th century is an age of reason and science and rational inquiry, but it's also an age of religious awakening. So when I was driving from Washington to Connecticut, I kind of detoured into Pennsylvania and stopped at a city called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I mean, I mentioned this to Sam before, and he said, like Bethlehem Steel, right? And so it actually, very early on, is a kind of industrial center where people tried to find more rational ways of making products more efficiently. And it's true. Like, we later saw a World War II submarine in Michigan that had things made in Bethlehem Steel. And so in that sense, like, it reflects that kind of part of the 18th century. But it was actually founded in 1741 by pietist migrants from Germany known as the Moravians. So we didn't say a lot about this, but this was a colony in Germany led by a nobleman named Nicholas Zinzendorf, and they were committed to missions. And so they sent many people off to North America, to Georgia, where they met John Wesley. And they have first established a colony in Pennsylvania called Nazareth on land belonging to our friend George Whitefield. Now, they had theological conflicts with Whitefield, so they bought another parcel of land called Bethlehem. And what's interesting is the Moravians, they value education. They believe in women's equality to a certain extent. His daughter started the first school for women in the colonies. They often support, George Washington slept there, Marquis de Lafayette recovered there, they have connections with the American Revolution. So in that sense, they're kind of Enlightenment-y. But they're a fervent religious group. They believe very much in personal conversion. Zinzendorf writes hymns about the blood of Christ, right? They send missionaries everywhere in the world, from Labrador to India to Pennsylvania. And I think in many ways, then we'd want to kind of they're kind of like evangelicals, except they're kind of weird. One thing they point out at the museum there as you walk through the initial house is that they didn't believe in the nuclear family. So when children were born, pretty soon they would leave their parents and become part of their own they're called choirs, kind of mini societies. So there was a kids choir, there was a single women's choir, single men's choir, and then even husbands and wives didn't tend to live together. They had their own choirs with other people. And then when it came time for conjugal relations, they would apply to the elders of the colony for permission to use, they had chambers set aside for this purpose. And that's how they would reproduce. But then the kids would move into and then eventually kind of find their own path. I mean,
So is this choir structure something you recommend in the pietist option?
I do not recommend that in the pietist option, but it shows, a kind of a willingness to experiment and rethink, and, a kind of nonconformity, right? I mean, at a time when middle-class English folks are really starting to move into this nuclear family, the Moravians are experimenting with other structures because it relates to their way of thinking about how do you build a Christian community. So anyway, that's a very long way of saying, I was thinking about these themes of, the United States is born amidst these twin currents of the 18th century of how do we build a more rational, efficient society, and awakening and revival, and still this kind of weirdness of Christianity that will in some ways be lost as America develops into a modern society. So that's my story. And if you want to learn more, you can email me and I'll tell you many more long-winded stories about American religious history. Sam, on our last discussion board of this summer, we talked about the Age of Reason and kind of moved back a little bit to the scientific revolution and asked students to reflect on their own experience as students who have consciously chosen a Christian university where they take a course called Christianity and Western Culture. How have they experienced the intersection of faith and science? Is the story of tension, of conflict? Do they reinforce one another? Are they separate, compartmentalized? What are some things that stood out as you read a few of the posts for that?
The first thing I want to say is Amy and I had talked about how we really wanted you to respond to each other, be reading each other's posts. And I'm somebody, and we talked about this in the very first webisode, I'm kind of skeptical about online education a little bit. I'm kind of skeptical about discussion posts. But you guys really nailed this. Like, reading through it, I felt it's the closest I've ever felt to, this is what, if we had all of us in a classroom having this conversation, This is pretty close to what it would feel like. So, a home run on that account. That was really great. Now, what I found interesting is here we are in the summer of 2018 at a Christian college. And I was interested how many of you talked about tensions between faith and reason, but it didn't, faith and science, but it didn't feel like an overwhelming tension or very combative tension. It was far more, if we're thinking about some of those kind of engagement categories, if I'm really like, how do Christians engage in science? What are the places where the lines get blurry, or you say, well, I'm concerned about that particular idea, but there wasn't a big sense of throwing out science whole hog, or science is this thing which is very, by definition, combative. That was the biggest thing, is there wasn't the sense that science, by definition, opposes faith. And what I was interested in asking you, somebody who looks at religious history, American religious history even, if we were to ask this same question in CWC Online at Bethel in 1968 or 1938, like, would the answers be different?
I think possibly. So, what I'd say, first of all, like, I wonder why they don't name it as an enemy, even if they feel it. And maybe it's because there are bigger things going on. And so in 68, I'd also wonder, like, at that point, there's some other tensions in American society. But one thing I'd point out is, at least at Bethel Seminary in the 1960s, that's when the big debate over evolution finally happens. Like, in other denominations, this had really happened like 40, 50 years earlier. And it started what's called the modernist fundamentalist split, which I think we might mention in the final museum. So, Bethel kind of pushes this off, but finally in the 60s, like, you've got seminary professors who are asking these questions about human origins and what evolution would mean for Genesis chapter 1, for other biblical texts. And so that's a debate happening on campus, is how do evangelical Christians wrestle with that? And can you be faithful to the authority of Scripture and accept the insights of scientific consensus, right, and experimentation? And so, like, it has struck me at certain points, like in Life of Bethel, that has become a kind of defining issue. It's a test. We're going to die on this hill, right? And when I first came here, the only time I ever gave the Scientific Revolution lecture in face-to-face CWC was my first semester. And within 10 minutes of giving that lecture, I had a student emailing me about the age of the Earth, right? Because I had just briefly mentioned that in the 18th century, British geologists are starting to question the kind of tradition that the Earth is 6,000 years old. And instantly, like, he had something queued up ready to go with lots of links. And clearly this was something he was, a metaphorical hill to die on. And that's kind of evaporated. Like, occasionally I'll still hear this from students, for whom evolution that's really a troubling idea, and what that means for a historical Adam and human origins is bothersome. But it's not surprising me that that's how you would summarize. I feel like this kind of ebbs and flows, and maybe it's because there are other things. The other thought I have when you said these are students who have come to a Christian college is it's a certain type of Christian college, right? And historically, we've drawn a lot of evangelicals, Baptists, conservative Lutherans, Catholics, and I know that includes many of our students, historically have not had issues. Certainly with evolution, the Catholic Church for a long time has affirmed a kind of theistic evolution position. And, after the kind of initial unpleasantness with Copernicus and Galileo and some other, the Catholic Church, moved much more quickly toward a position like, I think, what Galileo would say. Like, the church has a responsibility for answering spiritual questions, but God speaks through the book of nature, and science has a responsibility for answering physical, material kinds of questions.
And some of that connects all the way back to Aquinas. And when we talk about how important he is for the Catholic Church, like, that's one of the places where he's when you looked at Aquinas, he was far more open to saying we can learn a lot through reason, and the book of nature teaches us a lot. I mean, one of the things when I was responding to students things about when they were writing about Galileo was, isn't it interesting how much Aquinas, like you can hear Aquinas even embedded in Galileo's argument. There is this sort of special general revelation thing going on.
Yeah, so I mean, down the street from us is the University of St. Thomas, whose patron saint is Thomas Aquinas. He's on their chapel. I mean, I think Bethel folks sometimes like to kind of scoff at the idea of St. Thomas as a Christian university, but I think it embodies, in many respects, kind of a very strongly Catholic notion of higher education, which is the way that you integrate faith and learning is by doing learning really well. And for some people, that's in theology or biblical studies, but for some people, that's in like genetic research, or it's in social science, or it's in history. And the way you do this is by studying creation, using the categories of a kind of post-Enlightenment, empirical inquiry, rational thought sort of world. And that's a Catholic way of following that calling. So anyway, it's interesting because I think probably a couple of you named that, and I always wonder if that's a kind of tension, that confronts Catholic students. Is they might hear a roommate or a doormate suddenly talk about evolution and wonder where's that coming from. Okay, Sam, I mentioned in our last museum we're starting to get into more recent times, and one thing I think both of us were very excited about when we first designed the online course is we had a little bit of freedom to go into the 19th, even the 20th century a little bit, which CWC used to do until our curriculum was revised 10 plus years ago. So now officially the course only has to cover up to 1800, but we like the idea of ending with a kind of bridge. And we're kind of giving you a glimpse of what comes after the Enlightenment, right? So as you think about that, what are some things we brought back from maybe older days of CWC? What are some things we've added that really have never been a big part of CWC? What of post-1800 are you glad to see?
I want to point out three things, and I think there are three different rooms in that museum. I love that we have the Industrial Revolution, because what the Industrial Revolution does is it calls into question some of the progress, at least asks us to say, so we have this Enlightenment, Age of Reason, focus on progress, and then the next iteration of that really is industrialization. And, that's taking Adam Smith's ideas and saying, let's actually put them into practice. Rubber meets the road. And I think the Industrial Revolution is really complicated and difficult to think about. So I think it's important that if we end, which we do in face-to-face CWC, if you end with the Enlightenment, it sort of feels like, so we're right after the Enlightenment. It's like, well, no, there's like another big step there.
I mean, when I do that, like I mentioned Smith, and he has an example of a pin factory. And you're kind of like hinting at it, and we just kind of drop it.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's really great. I think World War I is really important. We put a lot of work into that part of the museum specifically. We teach a class on that. And I think that is, again, taking some of these ideas and saying, what if we take industrialization and say, what if we have a real industrial war? Okay, and that sets the stage for thinking about the 20th century. So that's another one. But my favorite one, because I think the ideas are really interesting, is when we used to teach all the way up to the 20th century in CWC, we would do a lecture on Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And I feel like that's a move towards saying, what if we're thinking, a last webisode, Amy and I talked about painting with a broad Buber brush. And if we're starting to say, well, what if reason is getting called into question as this end in and of itself, or as the organizing principle, I think those four thinkers start to push on the edges of that in really interesting ways. To say, well, what if we followed this idea all the way to its logical extension, and what does that mean about who do we come out as at the other end of that? And I think, and I remember when I was a student, they were sometimes thinkers that students were afraid of, and instead I read them and think, oh, no, these are like super important people to think about, because a lot of the world we live in is shaped by their ideas about tearing apart pure progress and reason, and maybe leading us, if we think about if we are in a postmodern era right now, like they're some of the prophets of that.
Yeah,
in certain ways.
I mean, I often tell people, because I didn't come from a Christian college background, I had no idea what schools like this were about, really. And then between interviewing here and then kind of my first couple weeks in CWC and like looking at the curriculum, three things stood out to me. One was the amount of art everywhere, and with no need to kind of explain it or defend it, but to say this is a valid expression of what Christians are interested in and gifted at. Number two is the strength of the physics program. Like it had not occurred to me that a Christian college could support a physics program so strong that my uncle, an astrophysicist who helped design the Hubble Space Telescope, would come here and give talks even though he's an atheist. And then the third was in CWC, it really impressed me that there would be a whole section where we would start to move into critics of Christianity. And I mean, in the Enlightenment, we're starting to get that with deism to some extent, atheists like Baron Dolbach. And then, like, once you get to reading not just Marx, but Nietzsche, especially, and Freud, I mean, that shows a kind of humility and a kind of hospitality that really increasingly strike me as what define this place. But also, kind of confidence, right? Like, we can ask those questions. We don't have to be fearful about it as Christians. And there might be valid critiques and insights there. Well, we might talk about this more when we kind of look back over the modern age and think about who's significant. I wouldn't be surprised if at least one or two of those people show up on our list, because even if we disagree with them, we find them hugely significant.
So we talked about how we start to preview the 19th and 20th century at the tail end of this course. But Chris, CWC is a prereq to another course in the Gen Ed, the L course, and the U course. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? Because students will be taking those courses.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we're very conscious of as professors, partly because some of us teach those. Like, say I mentioned, we teach a World War I course, a travel course. They'll be going again this coming January. It's an L course. And so because we teach both, we think a lot about the connections. So students, though, it's, they're just, there's suffixes. It seems like just a hoop to jump through. One of the reasons it's important to take CWC is it then sets up these other courses. And now you'll start getting choices. It's not just one course, it's a whole category of courses from different disciplines to choose from, but especially like L courses. Those are contemporary Western life and thought. They get into American history, but in some ways they kind of pick up the questions, the story of CWC, the themes, especially the Enlightenment, nationalism, industrialization, secularization, and then move it into the 19th and especially 20th century. So World War I is an L course because we're still asking, like, how do Christians relate to culture? What can governments expect of Christians, especially? Who am I and who should I be? How do I relate to other people? And we're interrogating reason. Is it reasonable for these supposedly civilized modern Western countries to start a war that kills 10 million soldiers, right? So, I mean, it kind of picks up some of those ideas and then moves it into the 20th century and a little bit into American history. And then the U course is a world cultures category, right? We mentioned way back when we start with Western Civ, in a sense, not because we think it's the best civilization or the most Christian, because it's the one that's easiest for us to start thinking about critically. It's the one most of us know best, even if only because we've assimilated it. And once we've done that, now you've got some tools where you can start looking at other cultures, both empathetically, trying to seek understanding, in the same way that we've asked you to look at Christians from the West who might strike you as very different, but also critically and thinking about what are these cultures. And so that's why, like, Amy's not here, but I'd want to talk about her course, History 212U, which is a history of Islam. We've kind of had hints of that in this course, but if you take that course, which Amy offers, I think, usually in spring, you will really dive deeply into not a single place, but a shared religion. Mm-hmm. And you'll find it's not just the Middle East. Like, a big theme of that course is that most Muslims don't live in places like Syria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Iraq. They live in places like in India and Indonesia and even in the United States. And you'll meet American Muslims or Muslim Americans. And in a sense, like, it's really not about Christianity at all, but I think you'll actually hear some kind of echoes of CWC in that course, and you'll feel better prepared to do something that, again, otherwise might seem very difficult as a Christian college student to do. Are there any other LU courses that you were a student, you took kind of an earlier version of this, or courses you know about that you especially want students to think about?
I really think you can't really go wrong in terms of picking those, but what my advice would be when you go into an L course, especially, but when you go into an L or a U, or when you go into Christian theology, go in with CWC turned on in your head, because there's a reason we have these things sequenced the way they do.
Yeah, I mean, one other I'll just mention because he's not here. Fred Van Geest teaches in political science. He teaches face-to-face CWC. If you want a real sequel to CWC that's an L course, take Fred's class on politics and religion in the United States, because that really is looking a lot of the same questions we've talked about, especially when you get to like church-state relationships, how Christian belief shapes political belief, political practice, But doing it in the 19th, and really especially up to the present day. And he at least sometimes teaches an online course. So if you enjoyed this format, that's another way to do it.
All right, Chris, this is our last webisode, so we need to think about CWC Endgame at this point, right? We have Exam 3, we have the exit interview. What can you tell students about those things?
I don't know if there's a lot more, exam advice to give us. I mean, I think at this point, students are kind of figuring things out. I know for a lot of my students, the second exam, they kind of figured out time management a lot better. One theme I'd say to look for is, in many ways, the third unit is about the triumph of reason, right, between the scientific revolution and the different manifestations of the Enlightenment. But then at the end, we throw in these kind of, but slavery and the treatment of women. And then we get to people like Marx and Nietzsche. We get to imperialism and, Jim Crow. In World War I. And so I think a way to wrap it up that in some way might show up on the test or on the final assignment is, in a sense, why is the Enlightenment so important to the West, but also how does the West start to rethink the Enlightenment and everything that comes out of it as we get closer to our own time? Excuse me, because we won't see you again until then, let's also mention you have one more assignment after the third test. It's called our exit interview. So in place of a kind of final essay, we'll give you 5 questions that will prompt kind of mini essays, like 250, 300 words. If you want, you can start the day after the test. We'll officially give you a day off, but it's tied to one final documentary film that kind of asks for some closing parting thoughts from our faculty we've interviewed. And at least one of the questions will tie really directly to that. And then the others will kind of, try to synthesize the whole course and try to tie together a few things and force you, at least in one case, to look back over the entire sweep of the course. I mean, I think many of them will seem kind of like familiar questions. You'll have heard versions of them before in assignments or in these webisodes or on a test. But you'll get them in a few days. So it'll be due officially on the first Friday in August, and that's the end of the course.
And the thing I would say about the exit interview is these are not short answer questions. We take your time writing these. This in total should feel like you wrote a paper. It's not, I'm going to jot down a couple sentences here and there. Yeah,
I mean, in a sense, it's why we've had you write so many response papers. That's all practice for these. And by the same token, they're kind of graded by the same criteria. It should show, clear interaction with the sources, whether that's a film or a drawing on readings we've used throughout the course or museums. I mean, it should show original thought. It should show you understand why these are important questions. In many cases, they're really asking for personal reflection, kind of application. And they should be well crafted. It doesn't matter so much on the essays, on the exams. That's a time pressure thing. There is no time pressure. You'll have several days to work on this. There should be clear, distinct, well-structured paragraphs. There shouldn't be lots of proofreading problems. These should be decently polished. And they really are your kind of final chance to think through some really important questions. So they should show a level of care, I think, and understanding. At least that's what we're hoping to see.
All right, we'll be right back with a little food chain. All right, welcome back for Food Chain. We're going to be looking at the most significant figures from Unit 3. Chris, you're going to kick off.
Okay. Now, I have to say, you've had a couple times to practice. I'm rusty. Be kind when you vote. But we thought...
already working the reps.
Okay, well, I'll stop. Okay, so I'm going to start with a religious figure. I'm going to start with George Whitefield. He'll go about here, I think. So why George Whitefield? I mentioned him in the first segment, right? Having conflict with the Moravians. In many ways, Whitefield's theology and mine are not all that similar. He doesn't start a denomination. I think the reason he's so significant is that as we think about what religion looks like in America, Whitefield is really the first, he's not quite a megachurch pastor, but he starts a new way of thinking about religion for better or for worse. One that is not as concerned with state churches, with organization, with structure. It's very freewheeling, it's very entrepreneurial. In some ways, it's somewhat ecumenical. It's very personal, it's very emotional. Which is good in some ways. It's also terrible in other ways. If you've ever, been scandalized by a celebrity pastor of some sort, and it turns out they're not the person you thought they were. If you feel like the church is a little bit too much like a business and not enough like something different, in some ways those themes go back to someone like Whitefield. But for better or for worse, as we do start to move into American history and we do want to think about religion in America, Whitefield is in many ways where it starts, and so I'm gonna include him as my example of kind of the awakenings of the 18th century.
All right, I'm sort of thinking about my list as I'm thinking about this unit. I mean, it tells a story about kind of the development of the Enlightenment, and then things that are calling the Enlightenment into question. So I have both those, and to me, they're sort of two heavy hitters for setting the stage for understanding the Enlightenment. So my number 5 is going to be one of those, which is John Locke. We talked a lot about Locke in this course, so I won't belabor this, but I think his ideas about natural rights, his ideas about social contract theory, about really radically changing the way we think about what a government is. I mean, we probably overuse the term paradigm shift. Like, it is a paradigm shift to say this is something put in place by God versus this is a human creation. And if it's a human creation, we can think differently about that. And it sets the stage for how we think about modern nations, modern governments, modern democracies, things like that. So he's kind of my stand, although I realize he's a little early, he's my stand-in for the Enlightenment, that he is a perfect example of saying that taking this scientific, rational thinking and applying it to something beyond the sciences. So I'm going to go with John Locke here.
Yeah, I mean, he gives us, through this idea of natural rights, a different way of answering that who am I question. I mean, you are an individual who bears rights. I mean, that is not an idea we have heard at any point up until this, but we just assume this.
And the second question, what is my relationship to others?
Yeah,
I mean, it's all in that social contract idea.
All right, very good choice. I'm going to go into the 19th century because we do have this little nod to the further development of the modern age with Frederick Douglass. So when I was at Yale, one of the things they do at Beinecke Library, which is the kind of rare books collection, is, I don't know if they do this every year, but they actually have a copy of the Declaration of Independence, and so that was on display. And then it was closed on July 4th, but on July 5th, they did a reading of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and then they did a dramatic reading of one of the most famous speeches by Frederick Douglass to an abolitionist group in Rochester, New York, called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And I think it kind of dovetails with the section you read out of his autobiography, because a big theme of that is his critique of a supposedly Christian nation. I mean, again and again, he asks, and he says, like, this is the most important thing that enslaved Africans do, is they worship God. They somehow found their way into a slaveholder religion and found God there. And yet, look at what Christian pastors, Christian lay people in this country are doing. I mean, I think it's one of the most patriotic things ever written because it holds the ideal of America so firmly and is so willing to point out the ways in which it falls short, but it also holds the ideal of the church so firmly. And so I think Douglass is hugely important because the African-American story is also a big part of the Western story, and as with Equiano, it's a story of tension and of disappointment and oppression and injustice. So I really kind of went back and forth between Equiano and Douglass, but because we have him in here for this version of the course, I want to put Douglass up there.
All right. My next choice is going to be John Wesley. And Wesley is somebody who's is sort of representing a continued outplaying of the Enlightenment, sort of in the Enlightenment era. I look at him in some ways, I can think about him as somebody who's mainstreaming pietism a little bit, right? Part of his religious movement is at least impacted by his connection to pietism. But he is, like Whitefield, is an example of somebody who is in his time, sort of a rock star preacher. Like, people flock to see him. He gets kicked out of the church because of sort of the responses to his preaching. But what I love about Wesley is that Wesley is, when he gets kicked out of the church, his response to that is to say, well, then I'm going to go find the unchurched. I'm going to find the people who aren't in church, who aren't having access to that. So that's the field workers, that's the miners, things like that. And the Methodist movement that comes out of Wesley, so Wesley's doing this in England, the Methodist movement that comes out of him is so foundational to American Christianity, to frontier Christianity. So if you want to read about a really interesting person, Francis Asbury is a Methodist who really kind of creates the system for how church works on the American frontier, and it's through this Wesleyan movement. So I think Wesley ends up being an abolitionist, and the Wesleyans end up being abolitionists, and I think it's just really, really important. So both at the time of the Enlightenment, but also pushing at some of those edges of the Enlightenment as well.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, Frederick Douglass is, I think, a lay minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and Sojourner Truth is an African Methodist Episcopal. The other thing I mentioned, because you have these two next together, is Wesley, even though he opposes the slave trade, also opposes the American Revolution. So I mean, there's a kind of, like, he writes something, argument, essentially, we are overturning our established authority. So he's a reminder that idea doesn't entirely go away as well. Okay, number 3, put a different English figure up here, Mary Wollstonecraft. It was really interesting to read students on the museum worksheet. A lot of, especially female students, wrote about Mary Wollstonecraft, Olympe de Gouges, the kind of early necessarily a feminist movement, but the beginnings of what we'll call the first wave of feminism, essentially to say that if we're moving into an age where who am I is an individual who bears rights, who is a citizen of a democracy and an economy, I mean, like, she is making that argument for women, and it's, even if it doesn't get answered satisfactorily for over a century in most of the West, some of the questions she's asking in her vindication of the rights of women are just hugely important. And I mean, it then sets the groundwork for later movements within feminism for economic rights, like the right to own property, the right to divorce, the right to education, the right to health care. And we continue then to wrestle with that into the 20th and 21st century. But I mean, because I haven't had a chance to play the game before, one of my principles is we do have a hard time finding women to include in our reading packet because women are much less likely to have education, the ability to express their thoughts are simply not recorded for us. So anytime we have a chance to talk about a woman from the story, I think it's important that we emphasize that story.
And I will say she's not going to be on my list, and that's definitely something my list is lacking. My next choice is the person I have sort of standing in for the argument she's making and the argument Equiano's making, and that is I have Frederick Douglass as well.
Right.
Because in essence what Wollstonecraft and Douglass and Equiano are talking about there are people who are not allowed to be part of the rights of this sort of Enlightenment ideals. And the reason I picked Douglass over Wollstonecraft is, I mean, it's hard. That was a hard choice, but I think that the centrality of slavery is such a powerful thing that I wanted someone to represent that as like a really huge issue. And in doing that, I end up missing this. I mean, what would have been great is if Sojourner Truth had been an option. You can sort of say, well, she's standing in for both of those. I think Douglass would echo the things that Wollstonecraft is saying, and Wollstonecraft would echo the things that Douglass is saying.
Well, and he's also a women's rights reformer. He's at the Seneca Falls Convention with Stanton, and so I think he's a great choice for that respect too. So we hinted at this in the first segment. I'm going to put Karl Marx number 2. I remember when I was in graduate school, I think, and I was at a family reunion back home on the Peterson farm, and a couple of my uncles I was chatting with in the buffet line and asked what I was doing. I was mentioning, well, in this class we're reading Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they could not believe it. They're like, why would you do that? Right? Like, I mean, as a Christian, why would you read somebody who thinks religion is this drug that sedates people and blinds them to injustice? And someone who believes in the material world, accessible to reason, doesn't think there's anything beyond it, right? And I said, well, because he challenges me, right? Like, in what ways is religion, serving as this opiate, drugging people, leaving them asleep? And why do I think that there's something beyond the material world? But the other reason is, like, I mean, I'm tempted to put Smith up there, right? Because I think we always short the importance of economics in this course. Marx is taking Smith's argument and recognizing implications of it. Marx, in many ways, admires what Smith is doing and trying to find laws of human behavior that govern production and consumption and work and leisure and the accumulation of wealth, right? All those things. But he is seeing more clearly than Smith, partly because he's later, what this is doing to people. Like, I mean, whatever you think of his solutions or of what some of his later followers do in the Soviet Union or in China or North Korea or Cuba, he has got a very fair critique of what industrialization is doing to increasing millions of people around the world. And it's not just Europe or America, but it'll increasingly be what we think of as the global South. I mean, it used to be the workers we thought about in the Middle Ages were masters of their craft who took pride in what they did. And Marx is pointing out, no, now we've got these essentially automatons who are pieces of a machine who are alienated from their work, who are paid as little as their employers can get away with. And what are we building to except revolution, right? I mean, if Locke is right that all these human arrangements are contracts, if something is unjust and unfair, why can't we tear it up, maybe by violence, and start new? I mean, so I think he's not working in some ways what Locke is talking about as well.
Yeah, and actually that's what I love about Marx. Thinking about Marx here is if we think about Locke as a paradigm shift, Marx is a further paradigm shift or a continuation, saying, what if we keep playing this out forward? And the same with Smith, saying, okay, let's take what Smith is doing and keep playing that forward. So for my number 2 choice, I have another person who is taking ideas that are out there in the world and saying, well, okay, let's keep thinking about this. I want to just briefly think about how Professor Paul Reasoner talked about Nietzsche when I took CWC up. So he taught in the philosophy department teaches in the philosophy department, and he talked about how what happens in the Enlightenment, what the scientific revolution and Enlightenment project is it's saying in the Middle Ages we used to have God present in the world, right? And we used God to explain how and why things happened. And what happens in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is we continue to sort of pull God out and say, well, now we can explain these more things through natural law. So less of the world does God have to be active in, to the point where we get to something like deism, where we say, well, God created the world, and he just sort of floats above it, and there's this string that connects God to the world. And what Nietzsche is saying is, do we even need that thing up there anymore? What happens what if we were brave enough to just sever that string and say, like, there actually is no purpose to that word? That's a vestige of a previous time. So he is not, in some ways, he's not saying something radically new. He's saying, this is where all these ideas head. Why is no one willing to say it? Mm-hmm. And that's what's so interesting, I think, about, the piece from Nietzsche where he's talking about the death of God. He's saying, like, oh, we killed him long ago. It's just like no one's noticing. And then he ends up saying, I've come too early. Right. You're not ready to hear this yet. So and that's why I think about these folks as sort of prophets to a certain degree too. And we can include Freud and Darwin in there too, that they're saying all these ideas are moving in this direction, and some people are holding back, but why are they holding back? So I think, again, you can disagree with his conclusions, but what he's doing is really significant.
Okay, I have a feeling our number one choice is identical. Should we do a reveal at the same time? Okay.
Voltaire!
1, 2, 3. Whoops. I took the wrong one. I'll put yours over there.
All right. Chris, why do you have Isaac Newton at top?
I know, I'm not a physicist, but I know, like, there have been subsequent developments in the field of physics with Einstein and later figures of the 20th century. That in that field, he's not the figure he once was. But if we are going to end the course with the scientific revolution leading into Enlightenment and people like Marx and Locke who are seeking principles that are rational, empirical, observable, understandable, applicable, it starts with Newton. Like, I mean, I'm tempted to put Copernicus up there, right, and say, well, this wouldn't have happened except for Copernicus. Except I think it kind of would. I mean, there are others questioning. Or I want to put Galileo up there because I really do. I love that reading that he writes. Essentially making this case for God has ordained two intellectual authorities, right? Book of Nature observed by scientists, and the Bible is understood by the church and theologians. But none of that really matters unless we find our way to Newton, who's not only he's explaining why that all happens, and then making the leap to, but let's not just stop with the motion of the planets. Let's think about all kinds of motion. Let's think about everything else. And let's invent calculus so we can explain it, right? I mean, at the same time, I know we use this cliche all the time, but there's this British poet in the 18th century named Alexander Pope who said, God let Newton be and all was light, right? Like, I don't think we understand how important, how foundational he was for this paradigm shift that happens around the year 1700 or so.
Nature and nature's law lay hidden light. God said,
I can't remember the whole
thing. All like, you get the whole couple.
I actually had to read a ton of Alexander Pope my first semester in college, and I've intentionally forgotten most.
So, I just to reiterate what you said, like, I think as I thought about this, these are all people. They're sort of these strings of ideas. They're all playing in the ballpark that Newton built. Like, every one of these people is impacted by Newton. And we talked in the last webisode when we were sort of debating the importance of Newton. We half-heartedly made the argument of, like, well, whenever you look at the history of ideas, and this is true for really any of these people, like, eventually someone was gonna come up with that. Yeah. That there is you can look at history as this kind of inevitability because it went in a particular way. But at a certain point, if we're thinking about the most significant people from the unit, we have to point to the people who are the ones who got there. Right? And he's kind of a quantum leap a little bit. Yeah. Like to move from where Galileo was to where Newton was, it's like it feels like they skipped a generation or two. Like, he actually pushed that really forward. And yeah, I think he's got it. To not have him at the top of this list, you're trying too hard, I think.
Right. The final thing I'll say is, we in many ways have then found people who are dissatisfied with this world too. Mm-hmm. And like, one implication of Newton, especially once you take it into the world of politics or economics, is we kind of had this progressive expectation, like, we can understand the world and we can make it better. And the only reason these people then are significant is they point out, but we're failing that.
Right.
Like, they wouldn't necessarily disagree. Like, Wollstonecraft totally believes we can do this, a reasonable thing to do. But it leads to this frustration and a kind of prophetic then dissent and critique to say, we should be living in this world, and yet we are still bound to injustice and superstition, and we are denying all these rational benefits to huge sections of the population, right?
Yeah, and Nietzsche's just saying, like, all this stuff happened back here, and maybe even before that, right? Yeah. So I think he's got to be at the top of this list.
Okay, well,
so we're not even going to let you vote on a list that doesn't have Newton at the top. That's where we're at.
But you might want to think about this for the third exam, and maybe even for the exit interview too, why Newton is so important.
All right. So go to Moodle and make sure you vote, and we'll be right back with Happy Time.
All right, Sam, just a couple minutes left to go. Is you ready for Happy Time?
I'm ready.
Okay, happy birthday to Bugs Bunny, who debuted this day in 1940 when Merry Melodies released an animated short called A Wild Hare. I think it might have involved Elmer Fudd as well. So, Sam, is Bugs Bunny or Elmer Fudd the best animated character of all time? And if not, who is?
Well, the answer is no, because I wonder how many of our students actually they may have seen Bugs Bunny, but do they really know who that is?
It's their loss.
Now, I will say, as when we were children, it was like a real battle between like Warner Brothers and Disney. Like you thought of Mickey Mouse, you thought of Bugs Bunny, and they were peers.
Yeah, right.
You know, like I don't feel like we live in. I feel like they have both receded from the culture a little, but Mickey still is like a CEO that oversees a big empire, and Bugs is not. Like in 1988 when Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out, it was a big deal that Mickey and Bugs were in the same movie. Like that was something. Bugs has receded. So I don't know that he's far more fun than Mickey Mouse if you were going to watch him. Wow. So I'm gonna just say no because he's lost his. He should be bigger than he is.
He should. So it was like a year or two ago, Minnesota Historical Society hosted a traveling exhibit on. It wasn't just Bugs Bunny, but it was on the work of Chuck Jones, who's one of the great animators of all time. And like I had kind of forgotten how amazing some of those films are. And also, I brought my kids, who were 6 at that point. They had never seen Bugs Bunny, and they could not stop laughing. They thought it was the best thing they'd ever seen. So if you don't know what we're talking about, look up Bugs Bunny, because I think it really is worth it. Okay.
All right. Happy anniversary.
Do you have a best animated character of all time? If not Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse, do you have someone?
I don't. I'm struggling to think.
The answer is Homer Simpson.
I was wondering that. Like I was thinking that, but it's weird to not have it be a Disney or Warner Brothers character. But it maybe is.
If you had to, I actually have a very, very fond place in my heart for Donald Duck.
Yeah. And I also wonder, like 50 years from now, how are we going to feel about Homer Simpson? He may be more problematic than we want to think.
Could be.
All right, happy anniversary. The U.S. State Department, founded July 27th, 1789, though George Washington waited more than 2 years to appoint 2 months to appoint its first head.
It's a badly constructed sentence.
Thomas Jefferson. Chris, what is your favorite government agency?
I want to say the State Department because I think it's unfairly maligned. I've got a former student who is an assistant director there I know it does really great work. I do diplomatic history, but I'm going to say the National Park Service. Now, I don't think I understood how great it was, except that I like Parks and Rec, and that ends up being Leslie's job at one point. But because I have kids, I've started to visit a lot more national park sites, and they're amazing and diverse. So on my trip, I went to 3. I went back to the Blue Ridge Parkway where I spent my sabbatical. It's like 80 feet wide, but it's actually a national park following this highway from Virginia down. I think it actually ends in Tennessee. And it kind of is meant to evoke early 20th century Appalachian life. So that's amazing. I visited a Wright Brothers site because I'm doing this biography of Charles Lindbergh. And so I didn't actually go to their house or shop in downtown Dayton, but there's a field where they actually did most of their testing and taught themselves really how to fly after Kitty Hawk. And this nice young woman who had just finished her master's in public history as a park ranger took me and one other guy on a nice tour of that. That was great. And then the final one was on my drive from Connecticut to Virginia again for my dad's retirement. I had an extra hour, so I stopped at Antietam, which is this great battlefield in 1862 where it was it's the single bloodiest day in American military history. And it's this kind of driving tour you take. It's kind of like a mini Gettysburg. And that's national park site. So I just think like the national parks in general truly are America's best idea. But even if you're not visiting the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone, there are all these fascinating little sites. If you're in Minnesota, go up north in the North Shore, go to Grand Portage, which is about the Voyageur and the fur trade. It's an amazing site. Okay. You seem convinced. All right. Happy trails to Vincent van Gogh, or it's actually Van Gogh. right? Is that
We'll go with Van Gogh.
Who committed suicide, I'm afraid, this date in 1890. Sam, as we look ahead to the 19th and 20th centuries, who is one artist you'd especially want students to know about?
Okay, I'm going to tell you the name of somebody that you probably have never heard of. And it's because what I love about Van Gogh, I'm somebody who have periods in my life have been a painter. I've been an art teacher. And I love artists. And Van Gogh is one of these who, when you look at their paintings, it makes you want to paint. Mm-hmm. Like, you can look at Van Gogh's a genius. You can look at a Van Gogh and you can imagine painting, because it's the process is very much on the canvas. You can look at someone like Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, and you're just in awe, but you don't think, like, that doesn't make you want to paint. Van Gogh makes you want to paint. So an artist from the 20th century who will make you want to make art is a guy named Ben Shahn. And part of why I love Ben Shahn so much is I did a lot of art history and a lot of scholarship in art history, and a lot of artists don't write much. They don't talk much about their work. They don't write much about their work. Van Gogh is somebody who writes a lot, because we have his collected letters. They're amazing to write. Letters he writes to his brother, where he talks about his development as an artist. Ben Shahn is the type of painter and artist who talks a lot about the work he does. So he has a lot of printmaking, lithography, painting, things like that. But because he likes to talk about his art, it opens up more windows into the work he does, and into his processes, and into thinking about making you want to create art. So I would say Ben Shahn, that's my guy.
All right, Ben Shahn it is. So I think that's pretty much all we have now for the webisode. Sam, any final words for students as we leave?
It's been fun. It
actually has.
This is the the 42nd one of these we've done over the years, and it's been a really fun season. It's been fun to have Amy as my partner here for most of this, to have you bookend the season. Sure. So when are we going to do an episode that I'm not in?
I don't know.
I've been in all 42.
I don't know.
So.
We actually did podcasts one year where you were not there, and one time I just forgot to hit record. So I'm not sure it would ever come off. It would be a great lost episode if we ever tried to do it.
That's right.
All right, well, I think that's all we have for you. Good luck on your final exam and on the exit interview. Of course, you can email us with questions, even if they're not going to show up in any more webisodes. Thanks for all the hard work you put into CWC this summer. Have a great rest of your August, and we'll hope to see you in class in the fall.